Okay, so maybe we should just talk first of all about the places where eye for an eye, which is the where the principle is most strongly rooted. Eye for an eye, tooth for tooth. Where did it show up? And it's easy 'cause there's only three of them in the Torah, but they are key in what's going on in those spots of the Torah.
And so, yeah, kind of starting with Leviticus 24:17 through 22, I think could be, in people's minds, kind of the classic formulation. And so that reads, whoever takes a human life shall surely be put to death. Whoever takes an animal's life shall make it good, life for life. If anyone injures his neighbor as he has done, it shall be done to him. Fracture for fracture, eye for eye, tooth for tooth. Whatever injury he has given, a person shall be given to him. Whoever kills an animal shall make it good, and whoever kills a person shall be put to death. You shall have the same rule for the sojourner and for the native, for I am the Lord your God. So talk about
Okay.
that.
Well, I'm glad you start with the Leviticus one and not the Exodus one, so that we can make
Yeah.
the point that Exodus might take priority in the thinking here, because when we get to Exodus, we'll see a very different wax on this issue. I think first of all, I've been focused on law the last couple of years, and so my thinking has tightened quite a bit in a good way, I think, which is, hey, is this a law, right? I mean, we call it lex talionis, which means law of retaliation, but is it even a law? I don't think it is a law, and I don't. And again, I don't think it's a law in the sense of you can't do it or not do it, right? There's no way to actually practice what it says. And what's really interesting is in none of these instances does it actually advocate practicing what it says. Um, so even here, right? It's animal, like it's talking about restoring animals and restoring human life with this principle of eye for an eye, tooth for tooth, at the same in parallel, right? You would expect it to say something like, "Oh, well, you could just pay off an animal death or something like this." No, you have to like whatever's going on with the humans, you do it with animals as well in some way. So there's some parallel spanning. I think the best way to think about this is, and the way I divide it up, is principles versus instances. And the principle, like do not murder. Well, that's not a law. It's not a command. I mean, there's no way you can keep that command. And there's so many, because then you start saying, well, what does murder mean? It's like it's killing somebody. Well, there's all kinds of sanctioned killing in the Old Testament. There's all kinds of sanctioned killing today, right? If a police officer sees someone charging at me with a knife and stabbing me, they can shoot them, and we would consider them a hero for doing that, right? So it's not just killing somebody, but it's killing somebody in very specific circumstances. And even, do not murder, you shall not murder, you shall not murder. Coming on the Ten Commandments, it comes down the mountain from the hand of a God who just killed, thousands of people, according to the story, in the hands of a guy who killed a man in Egypt, and that's why he had to go on the run. He was on the lam because he murdered a guy. And then when he gets to the base of the mountain and sees the orgy, him and the Levites murder thousands of people. So what does do not murder mean? And I think you just step back and go, oh, this is a principle, which means I need to start looking for the concrete instances that fill out what is murder and what is not murder. In the same way, eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth. What is the eye for an eye? Where is it aimed? The concrete instances retrain and restrain how we understand the principle, because you shall not murder and eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth could be taken 100 different ways, maybe a dozen different
hmm
ways. You could interpret it different ways, but the instances kind of lock down the parameters of how you might understand it. Um, that
So I
makes
think that's helpful to frame it that way, because then if we do go to Exodus 21, we start to get some of that. How far reaching is this principle and where
right,
does it apply?
and it
So
goes in a
let me
very
actually
surprising
read that.
direction in Exodus 21. Before we get there,
Sure.
I think it's also, it's worth saying, at least for all three instances, they occur at different times in Israel's, journey, as it were.
Mm.
And so when we go back to Exodus, there really everything we're getting ready to say is, well, if you think every word of Scripture is equal to every other word, then we have one task in front of us. If you think there's actually priority, as Joshua Berman has suggested, maybe Exodus is kind of on the run, what you need to know, law and instruction, and then it gets ratified through amendment, and which like the Constitution, where you don't change the Constitution, you just show how better to interpret it as you ratify it with amendments. So depending on which one of those views you take, depends on what you think is going on with eye for an eye as well. And I'm going to show why I think Jesus takes that Constitution and amendment view rather than the kind of all these laws are equal and you just have to figure out the concept behind them. Hey there, if you've benefited from this content at all, please hit the like and subscribe, or subscribe and like, one of those or both of them together on this video. It helps us tremendously with the math algorithm nerd monsters.
All right, so Exodus 21, 22 through 25. You could actually take the larger section because it gets applied over and over,
Right.
but this is where the exact phrasing pops up. And so it says, when men strive together and hit a pregnant woman so that her children come out, but there is no harm, the one who hit her shall surely be fined, as the woman's husband shall impose on him, and he shall pay as the judges determine. But if there is harm, then you shall pay life for life, eye for eye, tooth for tooth, hand for hand, foot for foot, burn for burn, wound for wound, stripe for stripe.
So many wonderful things going on in this passage. Like interpretively, there's so many interesting things going on. First, it's like if you strike a woman so that her child comes out, a pregnant woman, but there is no harm, and you're like, time out. In what world do you force an early delivery and there's no harm, right? So there seems to be already something present in their thinking, and I think I love that about this section of Exodus, where this is technically tort law, where there's harm done, where the constraints are so narrow. It's like laser focused, and you can say the same thing with if someone strikes their slave and kills them. It goes on to say it doesn't even deal with the death of the slave. It just assumes that the death of the slave is going to be avenged by the family of the slave, right? That family has the right to come and murder that person as a recompense. But it goes on to talk about, but in this instance, the harm is that man has paid for the labor of that person, and that's still floating out there as a problem.
Yeah.
So something that we would not, we hear that and we're like, well, what about the slave and his life, and how could, treated with equal dignity and all that? They just seem to be assuming certain things so that they can laser-like focus on the particular issue of the economics of the situation case. So here too, this kind of eye for an eye, tooth for tooth, life for life, wound for wound, burn for burn. There's a reason we say eye for an eye, tooth for tooth as a shorthand for all of that, is because when you look across the three instances in the Torah, they all only contain eye for an eye, tooth for tooth, life for life. And then it gives lots of other things in the list, but those are the only three things that are stable across.
Okay.
The other reason is the Code of Hammurabi, and you get instances that are similar to it but not identical in other ancient Near Eastern laws, where they haven't, if you strike somebody in the eye, it depends on, and this is important for Exodus 21, it depends on who you are. Now, you don't need this in order to make sense of Exodus 21, but it certainly illuminates the situation. If you are, if a nobleman strikes a nobleman in the eye, then it's eye for an eye, and he breaks his eye, it's eye for an eye. If a nobleman strikes a slave, he just pays a little bit of money. If a slave strikes a fellow slave, eye for an eye. If a slave punches up to a citizen or a noble person, then their arm is cut off. Right.
Yeah.
So there's the class system is reinforced in the law of retaliation. So what happens here is you'd say it's one of the unique features of the Hebrew law in the ancient Near East is the next two sentences that follow this. Right. So if you say, okay, eye for an eye is the principle, then we're looking for the concrete instances that will help us understand the principle. The next two sentences that follow eye for an eye, tooth for tooth in this very first iteration where Israel is kind of on the run and this is the instruction they need as they go, it's concerning striking somebody in the eye, and then the next sentence is striking somebody in the tooth. So here we have a pretty good candidate for concrete instances that are meant to help us understand the principle of eye for an eye, tooth for tooth. By the way, the rabbis struggled with this because they were trying to treat it kind of under the Roman concept of law and legalism. Not exclusively, but certainly you can feel a little bit of that floating around the background of their discussions. And, they're puzzled by, okay, well, what do you do if a one-eyed guy strikes a two-eyed guy and breaks one of his eyes? Um, so if you break the eye of the one-eyed guy, the Cyclops, then you end up making him completely blind, which seems to defeat the very purpose of the law in the first place, is parity. And one rabbi comments that a one-eyed man could basically do no wrong in that kind of a world, right?
Hmm.
If you say then we can't punish him because of it. So they're worried about licentiousness if you took this quite literalistically as a kind of a Roman legal statute, legislated and meant to be broken or kept. And so they're struggling with the idea that it's difficult to take a principle and work it into a statute. So what's amazing to me is the author of Exodus, which maybe is Moses or Moses influenced, says, okay, eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth. Next sentence. If you break the eye of your slave, male or female, you must let them go. You must release them. Next sentence. If you break the tooth of your slave, male or female, you must let them go. And you're like, well, that took a sudden turn, right? Because it's no longer, if somebody does something wrong to me, then I get mine. I get to strike back. I get to do something back. It's now I'm the one who's doing wrong, and I'm
Hmm.
particularly one who has power over somebody, and I'm using it to exploit, right, in some way, or I'm
Sure.
abusing them. And also you see all kinds of things packed in here too, like the law, the idea of paradigm extension, because you could imagine someone saying, well, like, okay, well, don't hit your slaves in the avoid the face, avoid the cheeks, right? Because this is the point that Jesus is going to later make, like, avoid the cheeks, punch them in the ribs. Because it doesn't say anything about that, right? Kind of like when your mom told you, don't touch your brother, and they're like, I'm not
How
touching
about
you.
here? How about
Yeah,
here?
yeah,
Yeah.
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 So I think what you see here is like, oh, you can't, if you just start thinking, okay, well, where else can't you touch them? And you start extending that logic out, it's like, well, you can't touch your servant at all. So that rule about somebody beating their slave and to the point they die or recover is already way out of bounds and a
Hmm.
capital crime, right? And that they're going to be avenged by the family. And we won't talk about, or we could talk about avenging by the family separately here. And so the warning is actually eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth. If you're to give it a shorthand, it means don't abuse your power against, when you're in a situation where you have power over somebody, you can't do what you want. You need to
Hmm.
you need to restrain that power, which is then really interesting how Jesus, seemingly focusing on Exodus 21 and not the other iterations of eye for an eye, tooth for tooth, again makes his whole teaching turn on somebody has power over somebody else and how should the
Hmm.
powerless person respond. He actually puts you in the role of the slave who's getting hit. Uh,
Sure.
so that's, I think that's, again, so if you say, well, maybe it is the cornerstone of biblical justice, eye for an eye, tooth for tooth, not lex talionis, but this Exodus 21, it's essentially you better mind how you think about fellow humans and animals, because you're going to see it later.
Right.
You can't hit animals and beat them and withhold and that kind of thing.
Yeah, and that's definitely where I'm coming at it from, and it comes from the sort of the verse that I think underwrites that rule, which we'll talk about in a second. But I did want to go to that third passage because,
Yeah,
as you said, it extends that logic beyond merely physical violence.
right.
And so in Deuteronomy 19:15 through 21. It says, a single witness shall not suffice against a person for any crime or for any wrong in connection with any offense that he has committed. Only on the evidence of two witnesses or of three witnesses shall a charge be established. If a malicious witness arises to accuse a person of wrongdoing, then both parties to the dispute shall appear before the Lord, before the priests and the judges who are in office in those days. The judges shall inquire diligently, and if the witness is a false witness and has accused his brother falsely, then you shall do to him as he had meant to do to his brother. So shall you purge the evil from your midst, and the rest shall hear and fear, and shall never again commit any such evil among you. You shall not, your eye shall not pity. It shall be life for life, eye for eye, tooth for tooth, hand for hand, foot for foot.
Right. So, perfect example of what I was saying is it doesn't actually ask you to take life for life, or it's
Hmm.
not life for life. And like you didn't actually kill the person, you just used your words and complicity with somebody else. and it's actually, in the Hebrew, it's a violent witness or whatever. That's the problem here. So, um, what's interesting to me is this: if you want to talk about biblical justice, and this is when people say, "Well, the American system of justice is based on the Bible." I'm like, kind of. There would be some radical modifications that, in some ways, would seemingly be better, right? Like, we just have perjury. We're like, oh, you may have some time in jail if you got this person on the death row because you and a person conspired and lied about it. It's also a world where you don't have DNA, you don't have any other evidence. As they say in the old country, your word is your life, and you're given
Hmm.
your word as a life, and you have all of these worries about giving oaths and rash oaths and what you swear to. Um, so I think here you have an example that this really is. It is talking about if somebody dies, capital punishment seems like the appropriate response, and that's where you then talk about the avenging family versus the state becomes a problem here as well. And so one of the things that I think is interesting is it is the avenging families. They're primarily responsible for a murder, right? It's not deflected to a disinterested state who's trying to accomplish justice, which as Americans we're like, yes, we're breathing that air, going, that's what we want. They do not want that. Um, and you can think of lots of different reasons why that would be. I cite in my book a poem from the Bedouins that of a man who hunted down his son's killer, and after he finished killing him in recompense, he said, "My side heavy saddlebags have now been balanced," or something like that. And I
Hmm.
think when you think about justice in this region of if somebody kills somebody, I mean, there's all kinds of things that are problematic. Killing somebody is especially problematic. But maybe the only thing that would make you not do that is the actual fear that this person, or even sexual assault, right? Why is a woman safe away from her fathers and brothers? Um, well, it's because they know the fathers and brothers will hunt you down until they find you and kill you. Uh,
Yeah.
and uh, and that actually has more. I mean, there's research on this. That actually has a lot more pull in deterring behavior than a disinterested government executing justice on behalf of the victim actually has almost no deterrent effect in almost any capital case whatsoever, unless you happen to be in a place where they regularly and publicly execute people, and so you kind of connect to the dots and go, "Oh, this could actually happen to me." But that doesn't happen anymore. I mean, like public hangings in the square, kind of a thing, right? Yeah,
Now, I do, when I read this Deuteronomy 19 passage, I have in the back of my mind Haman from the book of Esther,
right,
or, any Disney villain always seems to hang from their own gallows,
right,
right?
right.
But, there, it's actually the hand of God behind the scenes that is providing the justice and the deliverance, as opposed to, like you said, a disinterested governmental party. Um, I guess you could argue that that is the vehicle through which God chooses to administer this justice, but it's just an interesting, connection that they're making there.
Yeah,
Um,
I think that point you're making too is that it may seem cliche, but that God. Wait, there's a song called "God is Watching." Um, if we just pretend for 1 second that God was like Santa Claus, maybe I can speak in a way that we Westerners could understand. Imagine
okay.
a God who's like Santa Claus, who is omniscient and is keeping a detailed list of wrongs, right? Um, this is, you don't have that in the Bible, but you certainly do have this. If the one being oppressed or victimized, or the one being harmed, cries out to God, he has a special ear for those people. Exodus 22, just after eye for an eye, tooth for tooth, it's, hey, if you oppress anybody, like you were just oppressed in Egypt, and they cry out to me, you're toast. I'm going to kill all y'all and make your wives widows and your children orphans. So there's this kind of idea that that God saw, Exodus 2, where he says he heard their cries, he saw, and he knew. And it just ends there, right? That he knew. He knew what? It's like he is paying attention, is what you get here in these matters of justice. And it's why God can also become the witness when there is no other witness. So if you think about the test for adulterous woman, or I call it the test for the jealous husbands, the spirit of jealousy in the husband, the unfounded spirit
Hmm.
of jealousy, God is the witness there, right? So the woman can go confidently into that test in Numbers 5, because God's going to be the one that vindicates her if she is indeed um, innocent of the charge.
Right. So I want to switch gears slightly. I mentioned before, I find that there is a verse in Genesis that I would argue underwrites this principle. Do you want to guess where that is? We haven't
The
talked about this
Noahide
before.
law.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. Genesis 9:6, and it says, "Whoever sheds the blood of man, by man shall his blood be shed, for God made man in his own image." And so it connects the principle of Talion, lex talionis, to the Imago Dei. And so, this is partly why I'm so pro lex talionis, is the image of God is pre-fall that never goes away. And so it seems like, if there is ever an impairment of the image of God in someone else, the lex talionis carries the day, so to speak, in some way, shape, or form. Now, as you've alluded, when we get to Jesus, we'll have to deal with what that looks like.
Right.
But interact with that for me. I'm curious, what do you do with that?
Yeah, it's funny in common Jewish thinking. I think it's common. The common idea is that Noahide law is basically representing universal law, things that everybody on earth should know not to do, and it's a pretty low hurdle too, right? If you talk about like, it's like okay, only in cases of murder, which then you know provides a conceptual basis that's not completely out of sorts with what most humans think. It's not how most humans think about things that we know of. So I think all you get is if you kill, and it's if an animal kills a human as well, right? So I think
Hmm.
this is the
Yeah.
part that people are not always dealing with. Is like, well, why are animals held morally culpable for killing you? Only in certain instances, and you get that in Exodus, the law in Exodus. There, actually, immediately after eye for an eye, tooth for tooth, you get okay. What do you do when animals kill people, and what do you do to the people who are responsible for the animals that end up killing people? Um, so I think in all of these, you think, and I think you get this with Leviticus and Deuteronomy as well, where they just say like, look, there's some level of parity that has to happen here. It's not so it's beyond Noahide laws, right? So it's not just if you kill somebody. It's there's got to be some level of parity and justice. But if and here's where your view of the Torah and the view of Hebrew law really matters. If you think these are rules that are meant to be kept or broken, then you will have lots of problems all the way down. If, however, this is more like wisdom and instruction for village elders first, then Levites, then judges, and then ultimately the king, when kings come along, you can appeal to the king for justice. If this is the wisdom, including the stories in Genesis, are kind of anti-wisdom often. Here's what the foolish person does, and here's what it looks like. Here's how it goes sideways in 15 different ways. You have a robust picture plus instruction of what you should be doing in these situations, which are going to guide you to decide. What's interesting in chapter 9 is you've already got a capital crime that was not punished by God, right? You have Cain, who God refuses to do eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth, and actually protects him from eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth. When people find me, they will kill me, right? And God's not so with Cain, right? He'll be avenged sevenfold. That's a band, right? Um, or something like that. And
Yeah.
yeah, and then you get to Moses too. Moses is committed a capital crime, and yet he's not susceptible to the law he is getting ready to give. And Jonathan Burnside has made an argument that actually, in the totality of things, what Moses does would be fall under the rash murder, which could cut him some slack, but big picture, by Noahide law, Moses should be dead. It would have been right and good and meet, as they say, for
So,
the Egyptians to bear the sword in that case.
I think that's helpful to draw out, because when I think of the principle of Talion, eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth, It, as you've said, is less a command. When the eye is taken, you must take the other eye, or the eye of the assailant, but rather it provides a ceiling of punishment. So the example I always give is if I steal some food to feed my family and you cut my arm off, there's some poetry in the punishment, right? Can't use that hand to steal again, but the punishment far exceeds the seriousness of the crime. And so Talionis provides that ceiling. And where I think Jesus goes is he says, just because there's a ceiling does not prevent you from showing mercy. And it seems like that's what God is really good at doing, is showing that mercy, to
Very
these various
Protestant,
folks.
very Protestant take of yours there.
Go
Yeah,
figure,
I
right?
think the ceiling is a problematic view, only for this one
Okay,
reason, is because what it's usually the only view people have. They're like, oh no, this is meant to restrain people from overreacting. Certainly that is true. I agree with that. Um, but then it doesn't give you any explanatory power at all about Exodus 21's eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth, right? It's like, well, no, it's not trying to restrain. It's saying don't be in the position in the first place where this even happens. Um,
sure.
don't be the kind of person. I mean, if you like take it to its logical extension, is even if you are the kind of person who would be tempted to hit somebody, don't do it, right? It warns you ahead of time, which this is why I say I think Jesus is showing his chops in the Torah by he's doing the exact same move with the Torah. You have heard it said, and you thought it was this simple tit for tat or whatever. But I'm saying don't even do this, right? You've heard don't murder. I'm saying don't even hate your brother in your heart. Don't even. And what he's doing is showing what Exodus 21 was always doing, which is eye for an eye, tooth for tooth. But you're the one who's doing the breaking, and you need to like check yourself before you wreck yourself, kind of a thing. Which is a
So,
very unique. I mean, I don't want to make too big of a deal about what's unique about the Hebrew Bible. There's many ways in which the Torah echoes and resembles and alludes to even other ancient Near Eastern codes. But there are some facets of it that are absolutely unique in the ancient and modern world, and that would be one of them.
and if I could, I think the hinge that gets us from Exodus 21, Leviticus 24, and Deuteronomy 19 to Jesus is actually Leviticus 19, 17, and 18. I think the same logic is working in this, and I'm going to read it here just so we can kind of make that
Do you need
jump.
to read this? I think actually we should play a game called Leviticus 19:18 says, "Love your neighbor as yourself," right?
Yes,
Famously, that's the end of the sentence.
right.
What's at the beginning? Like, just let's do a. We could put a little music in here, a little Jeopardy music. What is the beginning of that sentence? In which love your neighbor as yourself
Da-na-na.
is the rather instead you should love your neighbor as yourself. Yeah.
Right.
Okay, so now go for it. Read that. Pause here.
Um, yes, indeed. Indeed. Dramatic pause. You shall not hate your brother in your heart, but you shall reason frankly with your neighbor, lest you incur sin because of him. You shall not take vengeance or bear a grudge against the sons of your own people, but you shall love your neighbor as yourself. I am the Lord.
Right. And start there with like principle or law,
Right.
principle or instance. Um, certainly confusing if you say, well, this is a rule, a statute. Like, wait, you can't bear vengeance, but you just got done telling me how to bear vengeance in this case and that case, right? So,
And would go on to do so again.
right.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um, so this section of Leviticus 19 is a lot of principled teaching. And you see the principle and instance in Leviticus 18 as well. You cannot uncover the nakedness of a close family member. And you're like, well, what's a close family? Let's get a definition here. And then you get lots of instances of definitions, right? That fill out, that again, don't exhaustively explore, but, because again, it doesn't say whether you can have sex with your grandma or not, but it assumes that you're going to logically extend that thinking there. So I think even in this case, it's causing you to rethink what you think vengeance is and what is, and this actually comes up in the gospel. What does it mean to love my neighbor, right? Who is the neighbor? And then Jesus twists this one again. Twist this one again to the end of Leviticus 19, where because the end says, "You shall love the foreigner as yourself, for you are as foreigners in the land of Egypt, and I am Yahweh your God," which is the exact direction that Jesus takes it. He starts out with, "What does it mean to love your neighbor as yourself?" and he tells a parable that ends with the Samaritan, who we call the Good
Mm.
Samaritan, doing the very thing that Leviticus 9 progresses towards. Leviticus
Yeah,
19, sorry.
right. I was tracking with you. I do want to introduce an additional point. I think I'm taking this from Gordon Wenham, but that there is a floor and a ceiling of the law. And so, we're just taking a step back from Talion specifically and looking at the entirety of the wisdom for the elders and for the people and however it plays out, that there's a floor and a ceiling, and that the floor might be an application of Talionis in an eye for an eye, but that the ceiling is this holiness that you are always oriented after as an Israelite, that is to not take vengeance at all. And so I think that's what kind of why I call this that hinge verse, is it takes the same logic, but then it applies it towards mercy. And then I think Jesus picks that line of thinking up.
Yeah, I, I think there's a lot going on in Leviticus 19. It's a complicated run of thoughts. Actually, it's a complicated run of principles and instances, kind of back to back, short up. But I think if you just say walk away, well, what is eye for an eye, tooth for tooth? Basically, what is that getting at in all of these instances? And I think right before this in Leviticus 19, I never remember the verses, but just a few sentences before 17, it talks about you don't defer to the great or to the poor. You're to maintain righteousness and judgments, like this kind of sense of like we're not playing favorites. The blind naked woman holding the scales kind of stuff that as we depict it today, or half naked, I should say. Um, and so there's all these principles that are meant to be kind of constraining variables, that you realize whenever there is no simple, well, you should just do this with them. And that you need to hear the merits of what's going on. And then you're in a thick, sticky matrix of principles with various concrete instances outlining them in which you have to operate. And all of it, what's interesting to me, just procedurally, because this book I wrote some historical fiction trying to think how this might have worked out in an actual Iron Age village in Judah. And what I realized was I think the best way to think through it, from my perspective here in the 21st century, is that it slows everything down, right? And it, like when you start taking on a lot of these principles and instances in mass that would speak to any given event, it causes you to slow the whole thing down, deliberate, bring in the best wisdom, people stopping and checking, going, well, wait, that's not exactly, well, what do we do with this? And we know this story of this person. And I mean, it gives you essentially what we would call due process today, deliberative effort, jury of peers gets hinted at here as well. So it's not like the American or British system upon which it's based is completely unguided by the Hebrew Bible, but we're just not a theocracy, and God isn't directly overseeing the justice system in the way that He was with Israel. And there's accommodations for that, some of which I think could come back. Like if you're going to if you're going to be the sole witness to basically get somebody put in the electric chair, as we used to say, like I think there should be more than perjury on the line. So, but maybe that's too extreme, and a lawyer could tell me why that's silly or whatever.